Welcome, everybody, to Soccer 101. My name is Taylor Rockwell, and all hail our benevolent soccer overlords who have never done anything wrong and are kind and generous in their actions, which is my way of introducing the concept of sports washing. It's a thing that has come to the forefront in sports in the last 15 years or so, but has been around for much longer than that. Here with me to talk it all out is the man himself, Graham Sovereign Wealth Fund Ruthven. Hello, Graham.
Hello, Taylor Rockwell. Yes, I'm very excited to do some washing with sports today. I've tried all kinds of detergents, but nothing gets those stains out like a good old-fashioned sovereign wealth fund. So let's delve into it.
Exactly. I think if anybody can do it, it's their billions of dollars. For those who don't know, Graham was a long-time outspoken critic of sports washing, but ever since his house tripled in size and the new owners brought in John McGinn to be his close personal best friend, he's been singing a different tune. Graham, I'm excited to hear all about the joys and benefits of sports washing and sovereign wealth fund ownership.
Yeah, if anyone wants a discount code as well for package holidays to Doha this summer, just hit me up. It's quite a place.
It's you and Mr. Q working together.
Yeah.
All right, Graham. Let's start with the very basics of this one. For people new to the idea, for people who haven't watched most sports of late,
or just participated in society in the last 15 years.
NFL, NBA holding strong. What is meant by the term sports washing?
Yeah, so this is a term that's been popularised in modern soccer and modern sport. You hear it all the time. It's become a pretty defining thing in the game over the last 15 years or so. And by definition, sports washing is, quote, the practice of governments, individuals, corporations or other groups using sports to improve reputations tarnished by wrongdoing. It is certain parties using the innate quality of soccer and sport as something people enjoy, naturally, to create a different public image when perhaps that party doesn't deserve a different public image. And even more cynical in soccer is the use of fan bases to get behind a certain party. And we can talk about this a little bit later on and why soccer is so effective as a tool for sports washing. But the TLDR is basically fans can essentially be weaponized, I guess, because we all know how tribal soccer can be. So you'll have the support of one club lining up to defend their owners because of the money that they've spent on transfers and shiny new players and new stadiums. And that's really depressing when that happens, because I can understand why fans might continue to support their club even if it is being used for sports washing. But when they willingly line up to be part of the sports washing process, that makes me sad.
I think that's a very good summary, Graham, including the part about it making you sad. It makes me sad as well. I would add, I think, it can be to improve the reputation after maybe something high-profile, publicly bad, or just having bad PR for a good long while. It can also be to establish more of an international reputation, or it can be both. Like I would say Equatorial Guinea hosting Africa Cup of Nations is both, they don't have the greatest, press freedom index record, to my understanding, or voter integrity record, but I think there's also maybe not as much of them being on the radar when it comes to African football until they host a competition and have the money to kind of put on this spectacle, and then you sort of get more attention, you get more of the spotlight on you, but as with, say, Qatar, you can get that spotlight in a favorable way that shows off all of the benefits to you throwing that money around.
Yeah, and there's a huge amount of grey area here in terms of defining what is sports washing and what isn't sports washing. I'll give you an example here, Taylor, which I have no idea where this falls. The 2014 Commonwealth Games, which I know is a big thing in the US.
Huge.
A lot of fans of the Commonwealth
The whole
Games.
country stops.
Yeah, but in 2014, Glasgow hosted the 2014 Commonwealth Games, and the SNP, the Scottish National Party, really pushed for that to happen, and that was because there was the independence referendum a few weeks after that. Those games. I'm sure there were other reasons as well, but it lined up nicely basically for this big showcase event to show why Scotland could stand on its own 2 feet and host this big international games. Is that sports washing? I'm not entirely sure if it is, but nonetheless it was making a political point through the hosting of a sports event. And there are different kinds of sports washing, and probably the most prominent kind that we've seen in modern soccer is when a state takes over a club, and it's usually an oil-rich state with a questionable human rights record and a bad habit for murdering journalists. So that is one. That is a
differentiator, Graham. To your point, unless somebody was delimbed to get those Commonwealth Games, I don't think that qualifies as sports washing in my mind, because you can't really separate sport and politics from sport. They have kind of always been intertwined, and I think that then extends to the history of sports washing. We'll talk about that. But I think so that to me doesn't mean just because politics are involved, it's automatically sports washing. In that case, you're trying to basically get the people of Scotland to be excited about being the people of Scotland by hosting this sporting competition. I think if it was Qatar buying Man City to make the people of Qatar proud of football ownership, maybe that makes a difference. But really, in my mind, it's a much more cynical, calculated move to get good PR, get PR that you can then control, and that can be favorable to you as you are trying to shift public perception of you as a country, what you as a country offer, or even the dominant industries of your country. Because I feel like sports washing goes hand in hand with countries recognizing that maybe the future isn't in petrochemicals. We have all of this money now. We might not have it later. So we need to pivot pretty hard into, let's say, luxury tourism. And if we own a luxury football club and their luxury airline and their luxury apparel manufacturer and everything else, suddenly our image goes from despotic country or country controlled by a monarchy or an emir or whatever it might be to country where the rich come to spend their money and have fun and relax. And that is a much more favorable long-term position, I would say.
Yeah, and that kind of hospitality luxury angle is really interesting because I did not know what Newcastle's shirt sponsor was until I did my research for this episode. It's Sela. I could have told you it was Sela. Had no idea what Sela was. They are a hospitality company in Saudi Arabia, so they're trying to project that image of luxury. Who better to do that than Dan Byrne, of course, wearing the Newcastle shirt? So that is definitely an angle there. Taylor, go on.
And I think another aspect of it then is it means that countries have. I'm trying to avoid overly negative words like they're hooks into a broader community, but ultimately it's that you have more influence, you have more involvement in other global networks, global organizations. It makes it, I think, you have more influence as a result. You are a more permanent organization that has more durability, I think, than just being a small nation with a lot of money that has to hope that nobody comes and tries to take that money or that land or those resources. And so I think in that way there's an element of self-preservation aside from just pivoting the economy, but also changing global perceptions.
Yeah, I think the point I was trying to make with the kind of Scottish Commonwealth Games thing is we have a very kind of, in the modern game and modern soccer, we have a narrow definition of who would want to sports wash, and there are
that's fair.
There are other governments, even companies, let's say a certain petrochemicals company that owns a certain Premier League club that plays in red are using Manchester United to sports wash. They're using Mercedes F1 team to sports wash and all the other things that they own. So there are different kinds of sports washing. There are different reasons why. I mentioned political sports washing. You might have someone who wants to legitimise themselves, maybe to escape prison charges in another country. I think Thaksin Shinawatra was categorised in that way, and a certain
Only
Chelsea
after
owner is only after the fact. Yeah. But you have a certain former Chelsea owner who bought that club to please Vladimir Putin or to give himself protection from Vladimir Putin, one of the two. But the sports washing can kind of be defined in a few different ways.
And Graham, I think that's a very important point to make, and one that I personally don't feel qualified to really comment upon. I promise this isn't but I'm going to anyway. There is this idea though that it's not when it's Roman Abramovich buying Chelsea, it's a guy with a lot of money buying a club because he wants to invest in a football club. There's nothing else to it, and I feel like as time goes on, and especially once he's then forced to sell, the narrative becomes, oh, he is Putin's crony, this is sports washing too, but it wasn't that way to begin with. It's not that way when another Russian billionaire buys Monaco. There is an idea that when it's African billionaires or Middle Eastern billionaires or Chinese billionaires, then it's sports washing, then it's a problem. There is an idea that it's very much who is doing the buying versus if it's Jim Ratcliffe, it's just, they invest their money into sports brands. That's just what they do. It can be, I guess ultimately, it can be a little bit racist, but I think it's also if nothing matters, if everyone's doing it, then nothing matters anymore, and it's all fine. And I think that's where I get kind of caught up in it, is it's better to, I think, just assume that the billionaire owner is probably not going to be this benevolent figure, but instead to assume that all billionaire owners are probably there for nefarious reasons, and you can still like the club that you like.
If Ineos wanted to make more money, there would be a much easier way for them to make more money than owning football clubs. They could just open a refinery somewhere and make like 10 times the amount of money that Manchester United or Mercedes F1 will ever make. So that's kind of the telltale sign for me with Ineos in particular.
A little bit. Let's look at the history for a moment, because as we both said, like it feels like it's come to the forefront, been a much more prominent talking point in the last 15 years. You have the purchase of Manchester City, PSG, the awarding of certain World Cups, the awarding of other international competitions. It dates back much further than that, though, Graham, and you can date it back to the Munich Olympics. You could date it, really, I think, the most prominent early example that I can think of, in at least from my research, I couldn't think of it before my research, is the 1934 World Cup, hosted by Italy, in which Mussolini is basically the chief person driving them getting to host that one. He wanted the 30 World Cup. They don't get it. They end up getting the 34 World Cup. He, to my understanding, is influential in like the restructuring of Italian soccer to make it more professional, to make it more streamlined, to make it more competitive. And then once they're given that World Cup, he, I think, has undue influence on some of the officiating decisions and a lot of how that World Cup is run, to project the strength of Italy, which is ultimately the goal. He wants to show the power and importance of Italy, and I think was able to do that with the way that World Cup went down.
Yeah, World Cups, man, just continually being used as a tool for sports washing. Obviously, the Qatar World Cup and the Russia World Cup more recently, but you're absolutely right, Taylor, going back to 1934. Mussolini's Italy hosting that tournament. You also have the 1978 World Cup, which was held in Argentina during a military dictatorship. And then if we're kind of veering away from soccer just for a moment, you mentioned the 1936 Olympics. The Olympics, again, is similar to the World Cup, a common tool for sports washing. That's 1936 is obviously the infamous Nazi Germany Olympics, one of the most infamous sporting events in history. I guess you could argue that the 2008 Beijing Olympics was a form of sports washing as well. You've got sporting events during apartheid era South Africa and during just like countless dictatorships around the world. So that's a form of sports washing too. And then just coming back to soccer, you've got these are some of the examples that I dug up in my research that I don't necessarily remember or knew about, but the 2002 Italian Supercoppa was played in Gaddafi's Libya, which is quite the example. The 1964 European Nations Cup, which was the first iteration of the Euros before it became the Euros, a much smaller tournament in those days, but that was held in Franco, Spain. FIFA gave the 1995 FIFA Youth World Cup to Qatar, which in hindsight was a signpost for what was coming. And then you start to get more and more examples of sports washing. Around the tipping point for me seemed to be about 2010, where you have Man City being bought by Sheikh Mansour, who is a ruling member of the ruling family of Abu Dhabi. You have PSG being bought by Qatar Sports Investment around that time. And then over the next decade or so until today, it has become this defining thing in modern soccer where it's just impossible to avoid. I was writing this week for the newsletter about the new champions of African football, Pyramids FC. Taylor, you'll never guess what country Pyramids FC play in, and discovered that they are owned by Saudi Arabia. They're owned by the PIF investment fund. So you'll struggle to find an area of soccer or sport in general that isn't touched by sports washing.
Graham, thank you for running through all of those different competitions and making me increasingly depressed along the way. I will admit, the Qatar, what year was it, 96?
95.
95. I think that also coincides with Qatar being in the FIFA video game for Sega Genesis, which has always been so confusing to me for so long why Qatar were in that video game. Because I just remember them being like the whipping boy that you could always score like 12 goals on. But they have stuck in my head as being in there because it didn't make sense to me then. Makes a little bit more sense now if that is the start of the Qatar push towards sports washing. You mentioned the 78 World Cup with the military junta. That is also a rare example of pastel washing because I believe that's the World Cup in which they secured the train lines. So to get from city to city for different games, you could take the trains, but they made it so that you couldn't get off the train except in certain locations, and they would block off, I think, parts of the view that were unfavorable. So they just erect like giant concrete walls. So you
the old North Korean tactic when they have a YouTuber in to show them how bountiful their supermarkets are with produce.
Of course, exactly. Yeah, see, it's the playbook that's been around for a while. But then I think there's also sections in which they had favelas in the distance that they would then paint different pastel colors to make them look like this beautiful picturesque village out in the mountains, and then back to the concrete wall so you can't actually see what's happening. So sports washing and pastel washing all rolled together. But it is then like strangely comforting that it's been around for so long, that it is an age-old playbook. It's just also very frustrating that it's a thing that we naively like to think of as being pure, and that the World Cup is about different communities from different backgrounds and different worlds coming together to experience different cultures and different lifestyles and kind of blending all together. When you think of it as like always having an ulterior motive and ulterior purpose, it's a little teeny bit soul-crushing, Graham.
Yeah, it is weaponization of something that is important to us and something that matters to us. That's the whole point. That's why it gets used. And my current take, and look, this evolves over time, but because it's just so difficult to avoid now, I've kind of decided that I'm not going to let it kind of infringe on my enjoyment of soccer or sport. Now, that's not to say that we don't recognise it. And when PSG won the Champions League on Saturday, when we did a review show, right at the top of the show, we mentioned sports washing, and I think it's important we continued to mention sports washing. We also then spent 45 minutes talking about how fun that PSG team is. So we are complicit in a sense, and I recognise that. Like me personally, I'm complicit in sports washing and my coverage of these teams and these events. But I also just think from a personal point of view, like I refuse to kind of let it and spoil my enjoyment of the sport. Maybe that's wrong, but that's kind of just where I've landed.
Do you think we should stop giving credit to ownership then, if things go well, even if sports washing isn't involved? Because that's where I get tripped up a little bit, is like when PSG win, I feel like because we've been so critical of their ownership and so critical of their approach to building a team, that when they do, it does feel like, oh, but, credit to them. They figured it out, and they made smart choices, and now here they are. Man City is a very good example of that as well, where, like, they've made consistently smart decisions, not even just starting with Pep Guardiola, but he is a huge aspect of what they have become and how they've been so successful. So you look at their player acquisitions, but their ruthlessness, but they're willing to then sign more players when they need to, but their willingness to hold off. And I think I see them as being smart owners, and I want to give them the credit because credit is due, but at the same time, the reason they're doing that is to get that credit. The only way I can think to truly avoid it is to just stop giving credit to owners, and then I'm not sure how you talk about certain teams without talking about ownership.
That's a difficult one, and I'm not entirely sure that I have an answer. I don't know if I want to give them credit, but there are times when you have to acknowledge the reality. Like Man City for a long time were the best run big club in the world. So yeah, they had the resources, they had the backing of Abu Dhabi, but
Newcastle, have Newcastle put a foot wrong? I don't think they can really be blamed for the Sandro Tonali situation, and now he's back and playing really, really well. I feel like they've been pretty smart in everything they've done. They've been really patient, I think, and all of that to me also kind of furthers the idea of the Saudis are in charge, they're making smart decisions, they're very responsible actors, and it starts to kind of bleed into political terminology and geopolitical terminology at that. And again, I get kind of tripped up by how much credit to give and the way in which I talk about certain teams.
And the nature of soccer as well makes this so unavoidable, because if the PIF, the Saudi PIF, the Public Investment Fund, they have investments in basically everything. They have, you name a company. I think they invested in Disney at some point. Apple. They invested in Twitter, Apple, everything. And so theoretically, if they invest in something and you decide, well, I'm not going to engage in that, you can choose not to watch the Disney film, or you can choose not to use Twitter or buy an iPhone. With soccer, it's not quite as straightforward, because if you're a Manchester United fan and they're playing Newcastle, what are you meant? Are you just meant to cover half the screen that Newcastle are? It's not a one-sided. You don't consume it through one prism. you consume it through multiple different prisms, which then makes it impossible to block out one area within that prism. So it's just impossible. What we're meant to do.
Yeah, and I think it's also like really nefarious is the wrong word, but it does like double duty there, because let's say like the Saudi investment fund, I forget how much they've put into Disney, but it is a substantial amount of money. I think it's millions of shares, certainly, that they own of Disney. At the same time, they don't own all of Disney, so you're not then thinking of Disney as a Saudi-owned company, and you can then kind of divorce yourself a little bit, or you assume, like, they don't really have any sort of active involvement in the day-to-day, but as a result, they don't loom as large in that involvement. You're not kind of giving them the soft power that they would otherwise get. With a football club, where you have a sort of captive, loyal fan base, you can get that sort of like, Saudi Arabia owns Newcastle. You can't really escape from that reality. And at the same time, you have a built-in fan base that like have to exist in that reality. So it kind of works even better. I think soccer and in general sports ownership like accomplishes the goal of sports washing better than any other thing out there possibly can.
Yeah, and community is a big part of that, because culturally soccer teams, certainly in Europe, are considered community assets. And so if you invest in a club, you invest in a community. And it is no coincidence, in my opinion anyway, that Man City and Newcastle United are both in the north of England, where traditionally there is a lack of investment and Westminster turns the other cheek. That hasn't happened by accident, that those clubs have been bought by Man City, have been bought by Abu Dhabi, Newcastle have been bought by Saudi Arabia. So when Saudi Arabia comes in Newcastle's case, and says they're going to make the city's team, the city's only team, by the way, one of the best in the world, and maybe there will be a gleaming new stadium and a new training ground. And oh, by the way, we're going to build new fan facilities in the centre of the city, which Newcastle have. They have a kind of, you've seen like Box Park, Taylor, in Croydon, where like fans can watch games. There's a big thing next to St James's Park, which Saudi Arabia has built, and maybe they'll build a hotel. And in Man City's case, they're going to build a new concert venue right next to the Etihad Stadium. They're going to redevelop this part of the city. All that stuff goes down well in a community that feels marginalised. And so in places like Manchester and Newcastle, it's this is back to the point of whether I should give them credit, but like it works. It's smart. Like going for Newcastle United was such a slam dunk decision by the Saudi PIF, and I hate that that's the case, but it is the case.
But it like that's where again it gets so confusing, because if you are investing money into infrastructure that hasn't had investment, that hasn't had opportunity, and now has nice facilities that didn't exist before, that are like useful to the community and usable to the community. Like, is it different than Roman emperors like putting their names on actual sewer systems, which is a thing that used to happen? I learned this week that like you'd have the Emperor Claudius Alexandrian sewer system that because you're welcome. Now you have public toilets.
Like it's a freeway or an airport or something.
It's just like is it that different? Like if it is actually serving a purpose and serving the community, if it goes back thousands of years that people have always like used that type of expenditure to generate goodwill and to benefit the community, it just gets murky. And I think that's why I have such frustration with it, because I think I also have a begrudging respect for it at the same time. Not a respect in it's actually a good thing, but just in a respect of how effective it is at turning public opinion, because I know how much it annoys me, and I know at the same time it makes it hard to be critical when you see people watching games when they couldn't watch them before and assembling as a community in a way they couldn't before.
Yeah, I don't know. It's just so difficult to pick apart. You see it in other sports as well. I think women's tennis, for example, has struggled in a number of ways to gain investment. And then a couple of years ago, the PIF saddled up with the WTA, and all of a sudden there's all this investment, which is great for women's sport, but where it's coming from is questionable. And so that's the dilemma that very much soccer has as well.
And I think maybe ultimately that is a differentiator for me. Like, Jim Ratcliffe might not care about the Manchester United women's team, and that's just because Jim Ratcliffe personally might be a douche. I'm editorializing. It's an American podcast. I can say what I want. But I think when it is like Saudi Arabia investing into women's sports or Qatar investing into women's sports. I know where they stand on women's rights. I know where they stand on worker protections and the like. And I think that's where it feels like you're not excited about this thing that you are claiming to be excited about. We both know why you're doing this, and you yourself aren't great when it comes to your historical record. And I think that's where it feels very much two-faced or very much disingenuous, I guess. And that is where I think it's like kind of overtly punching you in the face, sports washing.
Yeah, reserve that rage for when Saudi Arabia gets a Women's World Cup, which feels like it's going to happen. They have an interest in hosting the Women's World Cup.
Yeah. Dude, they have an interest in hosting everything, first of all. Second, Graham, like, it had never occurred to me until researching this episode. So you know that there's like the rivalry / outright like dislike between Qatar and Saudi Arabia, right?
Oh yes, of course.
Okay,
there was the blockage,
yes,
of course, a few years ago.
Like, I didn't really clock that, like, Qatar host a World Cup, and then suddenly it's very important that Saudi Arabia host a World Cup. Like, there is that level of competitiveness to it, and you can see how they're now both vying for that soft power, like, availability, and soccer becomes part of that. And I think the final age-old question is, what happens when they don't care about soccer anymore? What happens? How quickly does it fall by the wayside? How quickly is it jettisoned and not really a thing? Thus far, that has not been the case, and it doesn't seem like it will prove to be the case. But it is always the age-old question when a billionaire takes over your club is, if we're the plaything of the billionaire, how long until the billionaire wants a different plaything and we aren't the thing that they care about anymore? And we've had clubs kind of face that and in certain cases fall into obscurity, fall into financial hardship. So that is the other kind of looming question about sports washing to which I do not have an answer.
I'm sure American private equity will step in and everything will be fine when Clearlight Capital loan every single club in the Premier League. But you're absolutely right, Taylor. There's a pattern. This is what a positive episode this is.
I learned this week that Jersey Mike's was just bought by private equity. So much for Jersey Mike's being good. That's the end of that one.
It's like every craft brewery in the last 5 years as well has been bought either by Heineken or by private equity.
Yep. InBev.
But yeah,
right?
there is a pattern that you can go back to Sheikh Mansour buying Man City in 2008, which is a real watershed moment in Premier League history where you have a member of the ruling family of Abu Dhabi worth an estimated £17 billion buying a soccer team. And I think it's worth mentioning kind of who is criticising UAE and Saudi Arabia. So Amnesty International has criticised the UAE for its treatment of migrant workers and the LGBTQ plus community. And you mentioned, Taylor, there is another reason, which is a commercial reason for a lot of these oil nations to invest in sport, and that is to diversify their portfolio, which obviously has an expiry date on it due to their reliance on fossil fuels. But nonetheless, there's a clear sports washing element there. And then you have Qatar in 2011 buying PSG. From there, the floodgates open. You have Man City building a multi-club network that now includes NYCFC, Melbourne City, Yokohama F. Marinos, Girona. There's a few others in there as well. And then you have Saudi Arabia and their PIF buying Newcastle United in 2021, which felt like another watershed moment because of the sheer level of accusations made against Saudi Arabia at that time, and MBS and the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, of course, and that one spent quite a bit of time going through the owners and directors test in the Premier League, and they deliberated over whether to let the takeover happen. There was reportedly pressure from the British government and Boris Johnson, and then ultimately Newcastle became Saudi owned. So yes, it has been a bit of an arms race between, as I mentioned at the top of the show, our narrow definition of sports washing now tends to be like Gulf oil nations, but there is a broader definition as well. I think you can go back to 2003 with Roman Abramovich, which is another watershed moment in the Premier League. He is a Russian oligarch who has been, and there's loads of reporting about this. Someone wrote a really interesting book that I read back in the day on this, which I would recommend if I can remember the title of the book or who wrote it. But anyway, he is told by Putin to go out into the world, as all the oligarchs are at that time, extend Russia's influence, and he buys a Premier League football club. The other side of that story is that Putin was picking off those oligarchs when they displeased him, and so Roman Abramovich was quite happy to buy Chelsea because it made him a public figure and gave him a bit more protection. It made him a little bit tougher to pick off if he was in the public eye, and if Chelsea fans were lining up behind him after turning them into Premier League champions. So yes, there has been a pattern that I think you can trace from that moment until what we're seeing today.
I mean, on the one hand, like, I hear that, Graham, but on the other, You're talking about host of the 2018 World Cup, Russia, and I can't imagine that if they hosted a World Cup, they would do anything untoward. So I am not willing to accept these baseless accusations against my good and personal friend Vladimir Putin, and I criticize you for even suggesting so.
Who are you, and what have you done with Taylor Rockwell?
It was several briefcases of cash just came through, and I now have a tennis court in the backyard. So
it's mine on the way.
Yeah.
I'll take a tennis court.
Oh, yeah. Here's see, it's the arms race that's coming next, Graham. Congratulations to you. I joke because otherwise I would cry. Graham Ruthven, thank you for occasionally making me want to cry on this episode, but not because of what you did, but because of what you said.
Thank you, Taylor Rockwell, I think. Yeah, what
it is meant as a compliment. Because it is ultimately like, I'm laughing. It is such a frustrating thing. It is just also such a pervasive thing at this point that it feels like there's no sense raging against it, to your point. It's better to continue to celebrate the clubs, but not bury your head in the sand. I think just to be aware of that influence, be aware of when Manchester City have a great new badge or a great new kit, just know, I guess, ultimately, like, they want you to really like that new badge and that new kit. That doesn't mean that, like, you're a bad person for doing so. It's part of their intentional strategy. It's just also all kind of baked together, and I'm back to feeling depressed again, Graham.
Yeah, I don't actually have a Man City or a PSG shirt. I can't bring myself to buy one for that reason. But yeah, unfortunately, this is going to continue. If anything, actually, I think we're going to see more sports washing because we've got the 2034 World Cup in Saudi Arabia, which didn't have the same level of open bribery and corruption within FIFA to make it happen as the 2022 Qatar World Cup. But we still have a situation where Gianni Infantino has cleared the way for Saudi Arabia to host that tournament. I don't think enough attention has been given to that, by the way. The way that the 2030 World Cup is, with 6 different countries over 3 different confederations hosting, that is purely designed to clear the way for Saudi Arabia to host it in 2034.
Wait, can you explain that more? I agree.
Yeah, so it can't be. FIFA constitution basically says that you have to rotate the World Cup, and so you have to, with it being CONCACAF in 2026 next year, of course, they have to wait out 2 turns to then bid for it again. And obviously in 2030, you are touching 3 different confederations because you've got Spain and Portugal, which is UEFA, you've got Morocco, which is Africa, and then you've got Argentina, Paraguay, and I actually forget, Uruguay, is that the other one?
Yeah.
In CONMEBOL. So you've got 3 confederations there that are out of the running for 2034. You've got CONCACAF, which is out of the running for 2034 as well. So that leaves Asia. And even when it was it was stitched up in that way, Australia, they communicated a desire to bid for that tournament. FIFA said, you've got 30 days to get your bid in, which then eliminated Australia from that bidding process as well. And it was a complete stitch-up for Saudi Arabia to get that tournament. So,
I mean, and seen through that lens, this is my own editorializing. Again, we're an American podcast, not a British podcast, not a FIFA Switzerland podcast. That to me is pretty clearly member states saying, like, yeah, sure, we'll like wave on through 2034, but we, Paraguay, are now going to be hosting a World Cup game. Like it definitely feels like everybody made sure to get theirs a little bit, knowing that the fix was in for Saudi to get it in 2034. I guess Australia didn't get the memo until too late. So I look forward to them hosting the 2042 World Cup. Is that how long they would have to wait?
No, it'll be Saudi Arabia again. They'll just change the constitution. And
again, funny because it's true. Graham Ruthven, thank you for once again making me sad, but also entertaining me greatly on this episode.
Thank you, Taylor Rockwell. I await my tennis court arriving any moment now.
It's I think it's in the air. It's being airlifted in by 4 different.
Dangerous.
Those Marvel helicarriers, I think, are bringing it over. So, congratulations to you, listeners. I hope you all enjoyed this one. Thank you, as always, for listening, and we'll talk to you again next week.